Spring 1943. Over the dark, war-torn skies of occupied Europe, a crippled American fighter clawed its way home. The canopy was cracked, the engine coughed blood and smoke, and the pilot, bleeding, dazed, kept one hand on the stick and the other on his faith. Bullets had torn through the fuselage like rain through paper. Hydraulic fluid soaked the cockpit. The Thunderbolt should have been a fireball falling into German soil, but it didn't fall. It staggered through the clouds, limping west across the channel. German fighters circled, firing until their guns ran dry. Still it flew. Over 200 bullet holes, control cables half severed, canopy jammed shut, yet the engine roared on. When the pilot finally touched down in England, his aircraft looked like scrap metal held together by courage. He climbed out alive. That night, word spread across Europe. The Americans had built something unnatural, a flying tank, a barrel of thunder that refused to die. What began as laughter in German briefings would soon turn into fear. This is the story of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the warplane that changed the skies forever. May 6, 1941, Farmingdale, New York. Test pilot Lowry Brabham climbed into a cockpit that looked more like a steel bunker than a fighter plane. The prototype before him was unlike anything the United States Army Air Corps had ever ordered. A monster of metal and horsepower designed by a man who refused to play by aviation's old rules. His name was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born immigrant who believed survival mattered more than elegance. Reports from Europe told a brutal truth. Air combat was no longer about graceful turns or polished lines. Fighters were being shredded by cannon fire at altitudes above 30,000 feet. Pilots needed something new, something that could climb higher, strike harder, and still bring them home. Kartveli answered with brute force, an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, delivering over 2,000 horsepower. To feed its enormous appetite for air, engineers routed a turbo supercharger through the fuselage, creating the P-47's unmistakable barrel shape, a design born not of style but necessity. It weighed nearly 8 tons at full load, twice the size of its rivals, and carried 8 .50 caliber machine guns that spat out over 300-400 rounds. Brabham released the brakes. The big radial roared to life, shaking the ground. The Thunderbolt raced down the runway, lifted smoothly, and climbed like a rising storm. At 30,000 feet, while most fighters gasped for air, the P-47's turbocharger came alive, maintaining full power. Diving back through the clouds, Brabham hit 500 miles per hour. The controls steady, the frame unshaken. When he landed, his report was simple. It's not the fastest, but it's invincible. Kartveli had created more than an aircraft. He had forged a weapon of endurance, a flying fortress built not for show, but for survival. June 1942. Bridgeport, Connecticut. Rows of brand new P-47 Thunderbolts gleamed on the tarmac as pilots from the 56th Fighter Group gathered for their first look. Their reactions were mixed, mostly disbelief. Captain Robert S. Johnson, who would later become one of America's top aces, stared at the hulking machine and muttered, "They must have delivered a bomber by mistake." The cockpit sat nearly 9 feet above the ground, the nose so long that pilots couldn't see directly ahead while taxiing. Crew chiefs had to guide them with hand signals to reach the runway, but once airborne, everything changed. The Thunderbolt felt heavy, yes, but solid, unyielding, alive. The engine's deep roar drowned out doubt. Pilots soon learned that this wasn't a plane that danced, it fought. At high altitude, it ruled the skies. Its thick armour turned what would be a fatal hit in other aircraft into a shrug. Then came Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, a tactician who understood that brute power needed brain power to win. He rewrote the air combat doctrine for the Thunderbolt. Forget turning duels, the P-47 wasn't built for pirouettes. Zemke's rule was simple: climb high, strike hard, dive fast. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. From 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt would scream down at nearly 500 miles per hour, unload its 8 guns in a single devastating pass, and climb back to the heavens before the enemy could react. Spring 1943, the 56th Fighter Group's first mission over France. German pilots, confident in their nimble Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, saw the big American fighters and laughed. But laughter turned to alarm as their bullets bounced off the P-47's armour, and the Thunderbolts ripped through formations with speed no one expected. Within months, the Luftwaffe had learned a humbling truth. This flying barrel didn't need grace to win. It required only thunder, steel, and the will to survive. By mid-1943, the laughter had stopped. Across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe pilots began whispering about the American fighter that refused to burn. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked as a lumbering barrel, was rewriting the rules of air combat. From bases in England, the 56th Fighter Group and newly formed 78th and 353rd Groups began flying deep escort missions over German territory. Their orders were clear: protect the bombers, no matter the cost. The heavy B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators needed guardians, and the Thunderbolt was built for punishment. Yet its biggest weakness soon appeared: range. Once inside Germany, the P-47s had to turn back, leaving bombers exposed. Kartveli's engineers tackled the problem head-on. They developed new 75-gallon drop tanks, then lightweight 108-gallon paper tanks, extending the Thunderbolt's combat radius from 200 to over 400 miles. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to reach deep into enemy airspace and still make it home. With extended reach came new confidence. American pilots began flying higher, faster, and further than ever before. At altitudes above 30,000 feet, German fighters like the Bf-109 struggled to breathe, while the P-47's turbo-supercharged engine kept delivering relentless power. German pilots tried climbing to meet them, but their engines wheezed and their controls stiffened long before reaching the Americans. Then, Hub Zemke perfected a new strategy: Zemke's Wolfpack. It wasn't just a squadron formation, it was aerial choreography designed for destruction. Flights of Thunderbolts hunted in teams, slashing through the skies, diving on German formations in coordinated strikes. By autumn 1943, the change was undeniable. Once dominant Luftwaffe units were losing aces faster than they could replace them. Veteran commander Hans Philipp, credited with over 200 kills, fell in flames after engaging a flight of Thunderbolts from Zemke's group. His death shook German morale to its core. The balance of the air war was shifting. The Luftwaffe had ruled the skies for years, but now it faced an enemy it couldn't outturn, couldn't outclimb, and most terrifyingly couldn't kill. The Americans had found their weapon of attrition, and the Thunderbolt was leading the charge. Early 1944, England's airfields thundered day and night as the 9th Air Force prepared for something bigger than air superiority. It was preparing for invasion. The coming assault on Nazi-occupied France demanded more than fighters to duel the Luftwaffe. It needed warplanes that could shatter bridges, choke railroads, and tear apart the arteries of German logistics. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, with its raw power and near-indestructible frame, was about to become the Allies' hammer. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, a lean Texan with a flair for aggression, was among the first to see the P-47's new potential. He led his group on low-altitude strike trials, flying through curtains of flak at 350 miles per hour. Bombs, rockets, and 8 heavy machine guns made the Thunderbolt not just a fighter, but a storm on wings. The result stunned commanders, bridges collapsed, trains erupted, and convoys vanished beneath waves of fire and steel. By March 1944, the Thunderbolt had transformed into the Allies' premier fighter bomber. Its thick skin could shrug off 27 and even 37mm shells, its radial engine could lose cylinders and keep running, and its straight, stable wings made it a perfect dive bomber. Squadrons began practicing precision strikes, diving steeply, dropping 1,000-pound bombs, and pulling up through clouds of black smoke. When Operation Overlord approached, the Thunderbolts were already deep in battle. Weeks before D-Day, they tore across France, hammering supply depots, fuel trains, and communication lines. Rail yards turned to twisted steel, bridges dropped into rivers, ammunition trucks vanished in eruptions of fire. From Brittany to the Pas-de-Calais, German commanders watched their transport network collapse. One Luftwaffe officer admitted later, "We could move only at night, and even then the Thunderbolts found us." By the morning of June 6, 1944, Allied troops stormed Normandy under clear skies, clear because the Thunderbolt had made them that way. The flying barrel, once dismissed as too heavy for war, had become the spearhead of the greatest invasion in history. Summer 1944. France was burning and moving. After D-Day, the Thunderbolts no longer fought for the sky, they owned it. Now they turned their fury downward. Roads, bridges, and columns of German armour became their prey. From dawn to dusk, the roar of the R2800 engine echoed across Europe like rolling thunder. In Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, the P-47s became the sword that sliced open German lines. From 3 in the afternoon until nearly 10 at night, waves of thunderbolts swept low over fleeing columns near Roncy. They dropped 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, fired rockets, and strafed everything that moved. When US ground troops advanced the next morning, they found hundreds of destroyed vehicles, tanks ripped apart, and supply trucks still smouldering. One soldier later said, "It looked like a scrapyard the size of a city." As Allied forces pushed east, the Thunderbolts followed, hunting across France, Belgium, and into Germany. Their pilots knew the risk. Flying low through flak meant facing walls of fire. Even small arms bullets could shred control surfaces. Yet they kept going, trusting in the armour that had already saved so many lives. January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge. The skies over the Ardennes were locked in ice and cloud. German tanks rolled forward under the cover of fog, while Allied aircraft sat grounded, powerless. Then, on December 23rd, the weather broke, and so did the German offensive. Hundreds of thunderbolts poured through the clearing skies, striking at convoys, fuel dumps and bridges. One flight leader radioed, "Every road below is crawling, take your pick." Within hours, the German advance was paralysed. Even when the Luftwaffe tried one final strike, Operation Bodenplatte, a desperate New Year's Day attack on Allied airfields, it backfired. Though 200 Allied planes were lost, American industry replaced them within days. Germany lost over 200 aircraft and nearly 300 irreplaceable pilots. It was their last gasp. By February 1945, the skies belonged entirely to the Thunderbolt. Every time the German army tried to move, death came from above. The flying barrel had become the relentless hand of destruction, methodical, unstoppable, and unbreakable. May 1945, Europe fell silent. What had begun with laughter in German briefings ended with the ruins of a nation and the echo of radial engines fading into peace. Over the course of the war, P-47 Thunderbolts flew more than 746,000 sorties, destroyed 7,000 enemy aircraft, and obliterated 86,000 ground targets, rail cars, locomotives, trucks, and tanks. For every 100 combat missions, fewer than one Thunderbolt failed to return. That number told its own story. It wasn't just powerful, it was nearly indestructible. Pilots came to love it like a loyal warhorse. Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, America's leading ace in the European theatre, called it the best fighter bomber of the war. He said it wasn't the fastest or the prettiest, but it always brought its pilot home. In an age when lives were measured in missions, that meant everything. Even the Germans learned respect. Luftwaffe ace Heinz Baer, who survived over 200 victories, admitted after the war, "The Thunderbolt could absorb an astounding amount of lead. You had to handle it carefully, or not at all." The mockery of 1943 had turned into fear by 1945. The flying barrel had become the symbol of relentless endurance, the machine that outlasted, outfought, and outlived the Luftwaffe. When the war ended, the Thunderbolt didn't fade quietly. It served in Korea, in Latin America, and across Europe for years afterward. In Brazil, the first fighter squadron to fly P-47s earned a Presidential Unit Citation for its missions over Italy. The 56th Fighter Group, the original Thunderbolt heroes, refused to switch to the newer P-51 Mustang even when offered, loyal to the aircraft that had carried them through fire and back. In the decades that followed, engineers paid tribute. When the US Air Force needed a modern close support aircraft, they turned again to Kartveli's design philosophy: armour, survivability, power. The result, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, nicknamed the Warthog, still carries the same bloodline: heavy armour, a massive gun, and one promise above all: bring the pilot home. Today only a handful of Thunderbolts remain airworthy. But when one of them takes to the sky, its sound is unmistakable. A deep, throaty roar that rolls across the airfield like distant thunder. It's the sound of power, of survival, of an era when steel wings and human courage decided the fate of nations. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was never graceful, never delicate, and never easy to love at first sight. But it was a masterpiece of American engineering, a weapon of endurance that turned ridicule into respect and fear into surrender. The Germans once called it the flying barrel. History remembers it as the hammer that broke the Luftwaffe and the thunder that won the sky.